beauty, welcome back to my channel. Today is March 21st and it is National Teenager Day, which I don't know how come there isn't more hype about National Teenager Day. Haven't we all as adults been teenagers once? But in any case, today is National Teenager Day and I decided to celebrate teenagers. I work with teenagers, so maybe that's why I'm a little partial to them, but I also remember my teenage years fondly. I decided to celebrate National Teenager Day by talking about a few of my favorite teenagers in books. The teenage years can be a tough time, and sometimes teenagers get a little bit more flack than they deserve as they're trying to experience the world and understand their place in it. And since I don't read a ton of YA books, I suppose the teenagers that I read about, they come across as maybe more ingenuous, maybe more endearing, maybe more something. So I'm going to talk about maybe 5, maybe 6 books that are not YA books, but that feature some amazing teenage main characters. So stay tuned for my celebration of National Teenager Day. The first book I'm going to talk about is We Need New Names by Noviolet Bulawayo, and the main character in this one is Darling. She's 10 years old when we meet her. She is a young girl living in Zimbabwe, and we meet her and her precocious group of friends who have some terrible names, which is why this book is entitled We Need New Names. The English names that they've been called or names that they have given themselves speaks to the desperation of their circumstances in this Zimbabwe community, where we get to see the effects of colonialism and how an entire African community can be raised by the impacts of capitalism and the tendency for some of these natives to sell out themselves and everyone they know, to sell their resources, their precious inherited resources for a quick dollar. And what makes this book stand out, as opposed to a lot of other books that we have read that chronicle that experience of these African communities that have been raped and plundered, what makes this book so much different are the characters. 10-year-old Darling and her friends, they are not darling. In fact, they're pretty terrible in the way they interact with the missionaries who've come to help them. They know that they don't need the help. They know that they can do better, and they tend to mock and take advantage of these people who have come to help because they know that their motives are not pure. Eventually, we get to see Darling grow up and move from Zimbabwe to Middle America, and it is this contrast that shows how her life in Zimbabwe prepared her to live the life of an immigrant. And while this part of Darling's life that takes place in America is not my favorite part about the book, it does give an opportunity to see how a child who grows up in the circumstances that we see her in, we meet her in Zimbabwe, it shows us how that person becomes the teenager that she is when she's experiencing America and going through the stresses and trauma of being an immigrant, the stresses that often break adult immigrants, and see her triumph through it anyway. So this is the first book where we have a standout teenager in an almost adult role, but also being victorious. My second example is A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki. This is a novel about time, the fluidity and the unpredictability and the uncertainty of it. And in this one we have a teenage character named Now. She's Japanese and her name translates to meaning time. And so she's representative of a lot of the discussion in this book about what time means and how we can transcend time and how time cannot be captured, but it could capture us, kind of. There's a lot of discussion in this book about science and about quantum physics and quantum mechanics, but it is dealt with in such a way that you don't need to have a strong science background to understand the discussion, of course. And one of the reasons I love this book, I'll tell you the synopsis very briefly. Now is Japanese. Well, she's of Japanese parentage. She was born in America, but her parents are Japanese or were Japanese immigrants. Her father lost his job, so the family moved back to Japan, and she was having a really hard time fitting in. So she started to record her life and her thoughts in a diary. She's very interested in language, she's very interested in time, she's very interested in religion, and she captures a lot of her thoughts on these subjects in her journal. So she reads Proust, and in fact she uses one of his complex novels as the decoy in which to hide her own journal. Eventually, Now lives through the tsunami, or experiences a tsunami that razed Japan a few years ago, and lost her diary in the process, and her diary travels from Japan, washes up on the beach in Canada, where another character, Ruth Ozeki, finds her journal and becomes enraptured by this young girl's life. And while it's interesting that this other secondary character's name is Ruth Ozeki, not to be confused with the author Ruth Ozeki, we won't focus on that in this discussion. What makes Now one of my favorite teenagers is her interest in the world, her curiosity about life, and her interest in her family and how interacting with those family members, even their ancient family members, will help her understand and satisfy her curiosity about life. So one of her closest friends is her grandmother, or is it her great-grandmother, who's a Buddhist priest, and who she spends time learning from, learning not just about religion, but how religion and Buddhist thought in particular will help her be a better person. So she's funny and she writes her diary like a novel, and through her writings she chronicles her sometimes angst, sometimes confidence about being a teenager in a way that surpasses the expectation that one would have of someone of her years, and yet is totally believable. And so Now is one of my favorite teenage characters to read in a book that is not a YA novel. I'm making a special exception for the kid in The Elegance of the Hedgehog by Muriel Barberry, because 12-year-old Paloma is not quite a teenager, but if things go according to her plan, she will not become a teenager. In fact, Paloma has a suicide pact. She's decided she's going to kill herself on her 13th birthday. So I feel like we have to talk about Paloma here because, I mean, we don't know if she's going to live to become a teenager or not. In this one, we have an adult main character named Renee. She's a concierge in a Paris residential building, but she's an autodidact, so she's intelligent beyond anyone's expectation of someone who has her job, and she's been able to keep it a secret for a really long time. At least that is until Paloma comes around. Paloma, as a 12-year-old, is also intelligent beyond other people's expectations of her, and so both these female characters have become adept at hiding their intelligence from the rest of the world. But Paloma, in deciding that she no longer wants to live in the world because she's going to kill herself before she turns 13, she's decided that it's time for Renee to expose herself, at least to someone. Someone must know her aside from just Paloma, because again, Paloma won't be around. There's a lot that I could say about this book and the characters because it's one of my favorite reads. But the thing that will endear Paloma to you is that while she has this fantasy that she would like to remain as everyone's idea of a child, she decides to give up on her little fantasy in order to help preserve someone else. So she is extremely self-sacrificing in this way, even though she's been selfish in so many other ways. And so it is her advanced understanding of the world and her willingness to expose that advanced understanding by helping to out Miss Renee, who is another closeted, underrepresented genius. And for these two characters who build a very unlikely friendship based almost solely on the intuitiveness of the young Paloma. A friendship that becomes even more important as the story ends. Is at once heartbreaking but also a treat to read because it gives you some faith that children are not as selfish as they first appear to be when we meet them. And so Paloma is my standout teenager, almost teenager, number 3. My fourth character is Pi, or Piscine Patel. He's the main character in Yann Martel's novel Life of Pi. And in fact, for a lot of the novel, Pi is the only human character in the book. In this story, Pi's family owns a zoo in India, and on their way to Canada to sell some of their animals, the family gets shipwrecked and everyone is lost at sea, with the exception of Pi and a Bengal tiger and a few other wild animals who share a lifeboat with him for a voyage that keeps them floating on the sea for 227 days, which, if you're a math nerd, then you know that pi is 22/7, 22/7, 227. Anyway, we're not going to talk about the math today either. One of the outstanding things about this book is the unlikelihood of it really happening. And yet the story is told as though it is a memoir, and there are two iterations of the story, one where it's fictional and one where it's not. And at the end of the story, you're not sure what you believe, whether it is fact or fiction. Both versions of the story are equally unlikely. And Pai's unique capability, whether for survival or for concocting a story that is so delightful to read, whether it is fact or fiction, makes him our standout teenager number 4. Because if he made that story up, then we should believe it, because I never read a story like that before. Our 5th teenager is Jojo in Sing Unburied Sing by Jesmyn Ward. In this one, when we meet Jojo, he's just turning 13, so he's right on the brink of teenagehood. Jojo is a product of an interracial relationship. His mother and his entire maternal family is black. His father and his paternal family are white. And Jojo is growing up in the South during a period of racial instability. His father's family don't accept his mother or the children that are the product of this relationship. So we see Jojo growing up in this period of instability and with all these negative influences around him, where his mother's a drug abuser and his father is an ex-convict, and there's all this abuse and violence around him. And yet Jojo has learned, he's taken the positives from his family and has learned how to become a protector. And so what endears him to us especially is how he cares for his younger sister, providing almost a paternal influence for his baby sister that far outweighs anything that either of their parents can provide. So Jojo, not for being a teenager, but for taking on a more adult responsibility for his younger sibling, makes him one that you want to reach out to and do everything to try to protect this new teenager from every evil that the world could probably throw at him, and for the tendency of those negative influences that would try to rob Jojo of his innocence and of his pure servant leadership, the servant leadership role that he assumes in his family. And so while Jojo's characteristics that make him likable are not necessarily teenage characteristics, I really enjoyed especially the relationship that we see, his protectorship over his baby sister. And so I'm calling Jojo from Sing Unburied Sing my outstanding teenager number 5. And I thought I was going to stop there, but the book I'm reading right now has an outstanding young girl who, she's not a teenager when we meet her, but we do get to see her grow into her teenage years and out of them. And so I'm going to include Kia from Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens, just because it is my current read. And I'm really enjoying the portrayal of a young girl who is abandoned by all the members of her family. One by one they leave. And while she is struggling with solitude and trying to understand how nature provides parents and then allows for children to grow up without them, while she is pursuing that quest through a scientific but also emotional and relationship discovery, what makes Kia so admirable is her extreme resourcefulness and her incredible resilience, where for a lot of the situations that she's been asked to deal with, they would break someone who is a lot more physically or mentally mature. But Kia survives everything that the world throws at her and becomes at one with nature, and not just survives but thrives in this unlikely environment. And so I'm ending this video with Kia as my breakout teenager, although she's not a teenager when we meet her, my breakout young character number 6. So that's it. These are my 5 print and 1 electronic novel featuring some of my favorite teenagers in non-YA books. Give me a thumbs up if you like this video, subscribe if you want to see more, and let's talk in the comments. Let's talk about these main characters. Let me know if you've read these books and if you like the characters in these stories as much as I did, or if you have a suggestion of another breakout teenager in a non-YA book that you think I would enjoy reading, then give me that recommendation down below, and you never know, I might make a video where I read those books and just talk about those teenagers. So Let's talk in the comments, and until next time, happy reading, happy National Teenager Day.